Hi, Dr. Newman here. Today we're going to go into a little bit more detail about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, one of the greatest literary works of the Middle English period of British literary history. It is a narrative poem and alliterative poem. It is a chivalric romance. See the other video on what all that means. But we're going to take a closer look at Fitt 1, at the first section of it, and discuss what's happening in that and a little bit about the form of the poem itself. Let's get started. As with Beowulf, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight survives in only one manuscript. We're lucky to have it at all. This is an illustration from that manuscript of the Green Knight. And like, here's my head, wah. It's the poet who wrote it wrote a few other poems as well, including the Dream Vision, the Pearl, which is a really spectacular poem. But that's a different kind of work. Anyway, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. One of the first questions we want to ask, I think, an important question, is how does the poet establish setting right away? And this relates to your first discussion question. One of the things, when the Green Knight bursts in, right, he says, so here is the house of Arthur, right? When he's like, hey, who wants to cut my head off? And everybody's just like, crickets. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight belongs to what's sometimes called the Res Britanniae, or the matter of Britain. And that's a fancy way of saying the Arthurian legend. The whole mythos, think of it as kind of like the Marvel universe is a shared fictional world where a lot of different stories can be told by a lot of different storytellers in different styles, but in the same kind of with the same collection of characters and assumptions for how things work. The Arthurian legends worked that way in the Middle Ages. They were devised early on by Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th century, and they continue, I think I talked about this in the last video, and they continue to circulate and be expanded. Sometimes they're written as prose, sometimes they're written as poetry, and sometimes a writer will focus more on big pictures of war and politics, sometimes a writer will focus more on romance. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, I will say, focuses on the ethics of knighthood, in a sense, what it means to be a knight, what it means to uphold knightly values. It is written in alliterative lines, just like Beowulf. It belongs to a period we might call, I'm just going to write this in here, the alliterative revival. This was a period in the 14th century when England, becoming sort of self-conscious of its national identity and developing its own literature, revives this Old English form, which was Beowulf and a whole bunch of other Old English poetry was written in. One of the things that distinguishes Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is its specific structure of having stanzas that end with a bob and wheel. So it is both alliterative, but also organized into stanzas or paragraph-like chunks. And each of these stanzas ends with a bob and a wheel. And this is something that we find in Middle English and Middle Scots poetry, particularly chivalric romances, adventure stories. The poet himself speaks to the kind of dual status of a poem like this as being both written for oral performance, it was written for presentation, to be read aloud in a court to other people, but it isn't essentially oral, though it does have oral characteristics. We can think a bit about it as being transitional from written to oral. Listen to this in the second stanza on page 186, where the writer says, most regal of rulers in the royal line was Arthur, who I heard is honored above all, and the inspiring story I intend to spin has moved the hearts and minds of many, an awesome episode in the legends of Arthur. So listen a little while to my tale, if you will. I'll tell it as it's told in the town where it trips from the tongue, and as it has been inked in stories bold and strong, through letters which once linked have lasted loud and long. These lines speak to its dual status as both partaking in an oral tradition. It's a tale that's told in town, and note the alliteration, told in the town where it trips from the tongue, but also that this is a written story and it belongs to written record, as it has been inked in stories bold and strong. and then speaking again to the alliterative form through letters, which, once linked, have lasted loud and long. So much for the form. Let's talk about the setting. It begins at a Christmas feast, right? And in the first 36 lines, the way it develops at the beginning is we get a very sort of broad overview, you know? I mean, this is a story about Arthurian Britain, and yet it begins by talking about the siege of Troy and the destruction of Troy, and the tale of how Aeneas flees Troy. This is the topic of Virgil's Aeneid, a very famous epic poem, and how Aeneas's descendant, Brutus, will come to Britain and found the land of Britain there, fighting giants and all other kinds of strangeness that you find in Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, which calls itself a history, but it is so made up. Anyway, so we zoom in from this big historical view down to Britain, down to the court of Arthur, right, the regal rulers in the royal line, and then to the specific episode in Arthur's reign. It was Christmas at Camelot. That's at line 37. King Arthur's court, where the great and the good of the land had gathered, the right noble lords of the ranks of the Round Table, all roundly carousing and revelling in pleasure. So what's going on here? We're establishing the setting both socially as well as temporally. And some things to ask yourself as you read this is, how is Arthur's court represented? You might ask yourself also, what differences do you see between Arthur's court and the court of Bertilac, where Sir Gawain will visit during his adventure? And how do all these fit the patterns of romance that we discussed in a previous video? First of all, why Christmas? What does Christmas have to do with it? Well, it's a feast, first of all. And feasting was at the center of the social life of the medieval upper classes. They could be rowdy, sure, but they also had a ceremonial aspect of bringing the community together and defining that community. We saw a bit of that in Beowulf, where Hoeltheo, there's a ceremonial aspect to who she pours the drink for and who she gives speeches to and what order people give speeches in. Feasts were when communities performed themselves as communities. Christmas or Yule is a particularly interesting time, linking Christian practice with pre-Christian Germanic practices. Yule was a month-long event, and it had been timed prior to the Christianization of Germanic Europe with Odin's Wild Hunt. It was a pagan Germanic feast in which the god Odin during this time there was increased supernatural activity, this time which was of course clustered also around the winter solstice, a liminal time, a transitional time between when the days were shortening and the days were lengthening, when there was increased visitations by ghosts. We see this also in the Roman feast of Saturnalia, which also takes place around the winter solstice. But Odin led the wild hunt, in which where he rode with the spirits of the departed and the departed warriors on his 8-legged horse across the sky in his fur-lined blue cloak. Okay, so we've got a guy with a big white beard and a fur cloak riding on a horse with 8 legs. I don't know if that relates to 8 reindeers, but I don't know, I'm just playing the space with me here. Anyway, the events of Yule were held in midwinter. They involved feasting, drinking, and sacrifice. And of course, holly, which we still use in Christmas, the mistletoe, right, was sacred to the Celts and the Germans of the ancient world. So there's a link to this sort of Christian, but I'm not saying that that the Gawain poet is pagan. What I'm saying is that these things survive. They continue to be carried on and practiced, and that they sort of inflect the cultural practices long after their meanings are forgotten. The fact that we put milk and cookies on the mantle for Santa Claus, for this, spirit who comes and gives gifts, is a reminiscence of the sacrifices that were performed to Odin on Yule. During the 16th and 17th century, the Puritans, the very strict religious reformers of England and of also, as you might know, New England, they banned the celebration of Christmas as being not Christian, which might sound strange, put the Christ back in Christmas and all that, but they might have been onto something. Anyway, we get an extensive description of their feast and the way they live and the games that they play and the material luxury in which they live. The fabrics are described, the food that they eat, all the games that they play, and then there bursts in the Green Knight, and we get an extensive description of him from 136 to 220, and we're told all the things that are green. His shirt's green, his beard's green, his skin's green, his horse is green, and so on and so forth. What do all these details amount to? That's a question I'm asking you. I will say that some scholars have tried to find associations or links between the Green Knight and the Green Man motif that is found in medieval art, and there's this idea that maybe the Green Knight represents some kind of nature spirit. At the same time, the Green Knight is in his rich clothing and his sort of perfect gear, not an uncivilized person, and he challenges the manners and the maturity of Arthur's court. He shames them when nobody will respond to his beheading game. Finally, Arthur gets up and says, "Yeah, okay, I'll do it. You're not gonna shame us here." But then this is when he says, this is at 323. "Your request is quite insane, and folly finds the man who flirts with the fool. No warrior worth his salt would be worried by your words. So in heaven's good name, hand over the axe, and I'll happily fulfill the favor you ask." That is the Green Knight's challenge. You chop off my head, and a year later, come to my place, and I'll chop your head off. This is a kind of strange game, isn't it? Gawain, the nephew of Arthur, jumps up and says, "No, I'll do it. It's not right that you should do this." A challenger appears. There he is, Gawain. Who is Gawain? He describes himself in the stanza beginning at line 343. And he says at line 354, interestingly enough, "I am weakest of your warriors and feeblest of wit. Loss of my life would be least lamented. Were I not your nephew, my life would mean nothing. To be born of your blood is my body's only claim." So here's Gawain's chance to prove himself. Now, the Green Knight asks him his name, and he's going to ask him 3 times to prove him to ratify the agreement. This is, of course, a pattern that we see throughout traditional, biblical, medieval, classical literature. Where you have to say, where if you say something 3 times, you really mean it. Like the repudiation of Jesus 3 times by Peter in the Gospel. Look for patterns of 3 in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. They're going to pop up over and over again. A few other things I want you to look for as you read through this text are signs, symbols, colors, allegories. Think about the narration, the pace, the tempo. Where are those places where the narrator comes in and expresses his attitudes towards what's happened? Where are the places where the narrator shifts focalization, where he shifts point of view? This is a fancy word for point of view, right? We could say it's Gawain's point of view or the Green Knight's point of view or whoever's point of view. But another thing that we think about when we're talking about focalization is whether the narrator is describing external things that were happening. Gawain was putting on his armor, he was looking around, he was walking around. That's all external. Or internal, he felt sad, he felt shame, he was afraid, he was worried, he was sleepy. So that's another thing to look for and think about as you read and interpret this. Another thing, I think a major theme of this text is the idea of games and what games mean. Why are games so important, and what happens when the game gets so real that it threatens the very life? What is the meaning of the Green Knight also? Is he a monster from outside of society? Is he human? Why is he green and gold? Why are his feet bare? Everything else about him is beautifully dressed and highly rich, the clothing that he's described, but his feet are bare. What about the axe that he leaves? What is the meaning about that? What can you say about the way that the Green Knight talks and how he addresses the court of Arthur? These are just a few of the critical questions that you can think about while you read this text, and I look forward to discussing it with you in the Blackboard and the discussion boards and on Slack. So enjoy this poem. More will be coming about Fitts 2 and 3, which will be is everything that we'll be doing this week, and then next week we're gonna talk about Fitt 4, the conclusion, before we move on to Chaucer. So do well. I just want to say one more thing. A little low energy today. I have mixed feelings so far about online teaching. There are things I like about it, there are things I don't like about it. But the one thing that I do like about it is that I can't catch the flu from any of you. So that's good. But I hope you're all keeping in good health and using hand sanitizer and drinking lots of fluids and getting plenty of rest. Ciao.